It is a quiet evening in a kingdom long forgotten, and you are standing beneath high, vaulted ceilings where candlelight trembles against ancient stone. The halls are empty now, but once they were filled with the rustle of robes, the metallic whisper of armor, and the cautious footsteps of those who lived too close to power. You glance to your left and see the royal portraits, painted with pride, stiff collars, and golden crowns, but none of them meet your eyes. Behind their stiff smiles lie stories never told aloud, stories of kings who ruled boldly by day and died quietly, violently, or suspiciously by night. You are here to listen. For tonight, the throne does not shine with glory. It glows with unease. Every kingdom in history was built upon loyalty or betrayal. And every monarch, no matter how divine or absolute, knew that the crown came with a target carved into the back of the neck. Assassins moved in silence. Courtiers whispered with blades hidden beneath their silks. Even family members' eyes gleaming with ambition sometimes helped tilt a cup too heavily spiced with death. The stories you are about to hear are not fables. These kings truly lived and truly died. Some with dignity, others with terror. Some left behind revolutions, others left behind mysteries so strange that even now, centuries later, we are still trying to understand what really happened. But we begin not with a mystery or a conspiracy. We begin with a scream. It echoes through a monastery sewer in medieval Scotland. A king is cornered. His guards are gone. His enemies are closing in. And there is nowhere left to run. It begins as such stories often do not, with blood, but with unease. A restless shift in the shadows, a rustle too deliberate in the corridor outside, the distant, deliberate clink of a latch being lifted where none should be touched, and inside the chambers of the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, where King James I of Scotland had taken shelter for the winter of 1437. There was already a strange stillness, for the snow lay thick upon the stone, and the fires in the hearth crackled louder than any laughter, and the flicker of torchlight along the cloister walls seemed to stretch longer than it ought, casting elongated skeletal silhouettes like omens. The king, red-haired, intelligent, often ruthless, but fond of poetry and chess, had become in his later reign more a target than a monarch. For though he ruled with force and ambition, his attempts to centralize royal power, to crush the influence of unruly nobles, to enforce taxes with iron hands, and to strip lands from great lords, had sown more resentment than allegiance, and the old blood of feudal clans boiled beneath polished surfaces, whispering revenge through gritted teeth and clenched goblets. It was Sir Robert Graham, once loyal, then banished, and finally emboldened by hatred, who led the conspiracy joined by a cluster of Highland nobles, and even it was said by the family of the king's own queen, for power cares little for family and less still for the bonds of gratitude or kinship. And so they came silently, heavily armed, slipping past bribed guards, some of whom would mysteriously vanish the following morning. And they carried with them the kind of rage that demands not only death, but spectacle. King James, moments before the attack, had been playing a game of chess and jesting lightly with his courtiers, when a servant came breathless to the queen and whispered something urgent in her ear, and she turned pale. For the warning had come too late by the time they moved to secure the doors. The iron bolts had been removed from their sockets, hidden days earlier by one of the conspirators, and now in the dead of night, the assassins surged forward, boots slamming against flagstones echoing like thunder. Panicked and desperate, the king attempted to flee, and discovering that the windows were barred and the doors compromised, he made for a small sewer tunnel hidden beneath the floorboards of his chamber. A tunnel he had once ordered blocked for safety, and now had reopened mere days before. Though fate or irony would conspire once again, for when he attempted to descend into the tunnel, he found that the exit had been sealed with iron nails by the gardener, trying to prevent tennis balls from being lost through it. And so the King of Scotland, trapped in a tunnel, bruised and bleeding, could go no further. They found him there, crumpled like a wounded stag in the dark. His face lit only by the trembling light of the torches above, and they came down upon him with swords and daggers while he screamed. Not words of defiance, not proclamations of sovereignty, but desperate cries for mercy, for he knew that this was not a political killing, not a swift blade in the dark, but a blood right of vengeance. And they stabbed him not once but 16 times in the chest, neck, and groin until the stone walls were streaked with royal blood, and silence returned to the tunnel once more. Above him, the queen had tried to intervene, screaming, and throwing herself between her husband and the murderers. And though she was wounded, struck by a blade across her side, she survived. And when the conspirators had fled into the Highland mists, her vengeance would come swift and unrelenting. For Catherine was no idle consort, but a woman of action, and within weeks, dozens of those involved in the plot were captured, tortured, and executed. Some flayed alive, some hung in iron cages, and one Robert Graham himself was torn limb from limb in a public square, his entrails cast to dogs. But none of it could bring back the king who had died in filth and fear, whose final breath steamed into the cold air of a monastery sewer, whose murder would linger like smoke in Scottish memory, not only for its brutality, but for its symbolism, that no amount of planning, no fortress of royal authority, no circle of golden crowns or ceremonial courts could protect a king who had made too many enemies and ignored perhaps for too long the whispers in the dark. In the wake of that dreadful night, when the blood of a king seeped slowly between the stone cracks of a monastery floor, and the cold wind outside carried no echo but the scream of a wounded queen, all of Scotland seemed to fall into a hush so deep it was as if the entire land held its breath, not in mourning alone, though mourning there was but in dread for the death of a monarch, especially one slain not on the battlefield or by illness, but by the hands of his own nobles within the supposed sanctuary of a religious house, signaled a fracture far more terrifying than rebellion or famine. A breach in the invisible contract between ruler and ruled, between power and those who serve it. Queen Joan Beaufort, the English-born consort, who had shared James's ambitions and indeed much of his iron resolve, did not collapse beneath the weight of loss. Nor did she retreat into cloistered grief as many expected of a widow and queen. But rather she rose, pale and wounded, blood still drying on her torn sleeves, and with a fury honed by both politics and heartbreak, she summoned loyalists, messengers, soldiers, and lawyers, and in her trembling hands she carried not just her personal sorrow, but the full weight of royal vengeance, sharpened and burning like steel pulled fresh from the forge. It was not enough to name names, she wanted faces dragged into sunlight, and she wanted them broken. Within a fortnight, arrests began swift and merciless, for the network of the conspiracy had spread wide, involving not only Robert Graham, the vengeful knight, but nobles from the Highland clans, who had long chafed under James's reforms, servants from within the royal household. Even certain members of the Queen's extended family, whose silence or inaction had allowed blades to slip through barred doors. And these were not accused quietly, but paraded before courts, denounced publicly, tortured brutally, and sentenced with an efficiency that startled even seasoned judges. And the punishments, oh the punishments! They were not executions in the civilized sense, not noble beheadings or dignified trials followed by quick deaths, but theatrical spectacles of pain and destruction, designed not only to eliminate the guilty, but to engrave terror into the minds of the living. Robert Stewart, one of the conspirators, was stripped bound and disemboweled alive before a roaring crowd, while his entrails were burned before his dying eyes. Others were hung by their ankles, beaten with iron rods, or flayed so that their skin peeled away like wet parchment. And one, it is said, was nailed to a wooden wheel and spun until every bone shattered. Yet, despite the horrors meted out in the name of justice, Or perhaps because of them, something shifted in the air of the Scottish court. For though James's son, the 6-year-old James II, was crowned under the guidance of a regency, and though Queen Joan acted as a steadying presence during those turbulent early years, the sense of divine right that had once girded the monarchy now seemed fragile, hairline cracked, as if the idea that a king could be killed like any other man, cornered, stabbed, bleeding in filth, had unlocked a door that could not be closed again. In whispers, the court spoke of curses. Some claimed that the king's soul, restless and betrayed, haunted the monastery still, that his footsteps could be heard echoing faintly in the tunnels where he fell, and that a streak of rust along one wall never quite faded, no matter how many times the monks scrubbed it. Others, more pragmatic but no less superstitious, feared the precedent more than the ghost, that once one king fell by dagger, others might follow, and that assassination, like a poison once tasted, might become part of the political diet of the realm. And so, in the years that followed, the Scottish crown would tread carefully, often ruled more by the will of the nobles than by the strength of kings, and James II, raised under the shadow of his father's murder, would grow into a monarch who bore not just the memory of the bloodbath at Perth, but the quiet, gnawing fear that the throne itself was less a seat of power and more a target draped in velvet. Thus, the legacy of James I's death was not merely a tragedy or a tale of revenge. It was a transformation, the moment when the illusion of invincibility slipped from the monarchy like a dying breath, and all who wore the crown thereafter would feel in the cool stillness of night the unseen point of a dagger pressing softly at the base of the skull. Some deaths are quick, clean, and final, a blade across the throat, a cup drained too fast, a single arrow loosed from far away, but others unfold like a grim parable, slowly, oddly filled with such dark absurdity that one begins to wonder whether fate itself, having grown weary of cruelty, has leaned into comedy. And in the case of Charles II of Navarre, that cunning, bitter, restless king, known to friend and enemy alike as Charles the Bad, it seems almost as though the hand that wrote his final scene was not so much guided by justice as it was amused by irony. For he had spent his life deceiving, plotting, surviving a spider at the center of his web of lies, weaving alliances and betrayals across France and Spain like threads too tangled to follow. And though he never ruled a vast empire nor won great victories on the field, he was feared all the same, for his poison was political and literal alike, his ambition unshakable and his reputation already blackened in his own lifetime by whispers of murder, secret torture, and midnight disappearances. But it was not his enemies that brought about his end, nor even the slow, crumbling grip of age, though he had grown weak, racked with illness, his limbs trembling, his skin pallid and sagging. It was something far smaller, far quieter, and it began as many things do with a well-meaning servant and a bottle of brandy. In the waning days of 1387, in the royal chambers of Navarre, Charles had fallen ill with some wasting fever, and his physicians, those anxious custodians of royal life, who often did more harm than good, consulted among themselves and decided that to strengthen the king's failing body, they would wrap his limbs and torso in cloth soaked with medicinal spirits, a practice not uncommon in those days, especially when mixed with herbs or oils meant to draw out sickness. And so they took clean linen, soaked it in brandy, and bound him tightly limb by limb, until he resembled not so much a king as a marinating relic waiting to be preserved. But then came the moment. Perhaps it was clumsiness, perhaps fatigue, perhaps no one truly knows. But the nurse attending him, either to seal the ends of the cloth or to warm them, history is vague on this detail, lit a candle or struck a match, and the vaporous fumes of the alcohol caught in an instant, and in one terrible blinding flash, the King of Navarre was no longer a man, but a torch. They say the flames raced up his body faster than a breath, that he shrieked and twisted his bindings, turning to blazing cords, the smell of burning flesh filling the room. Before a scream had even ended, and though servants rushed to smother him, to beat back the flames with blankets and cloaks and prayers, it was too late for Charles. The bad master of poisons, deceiver of kings, tormentor of enemies, had been undone not by dagger or goblet, but by the very linens meant to heal him. He lingered in agony for hours, blackened, blistered, silent by the end. Some say he cursed the woman who lit the fire. Others say he forgave her. Still others claim he died without a word, eyes wide with disbelief, as if even in his final moments he could not comprehend that such an unworthy, ridiculous death had dared to claim him, that he who had orchestrated assassinations, who had bribed killers and betrayed allies, who had written his legacy in shadow and blood, would perish like a peasant in a kitchen fire. And when word spread of his death, there was no great mourning in Navarre, no weeping crowds, no bell tolls in far-off courts, only the quiet shiver of recognition among those who understood that power, no matter how cunning, no matter how cruel, is still just skin and breath and weakness beneath its robes. His enemies did not celebrate. They simply noted the passing, nodded once, and moved on. And in time, the details of his death passed into legend, repeated in whispers and smirks, until the memory of Charles the Bad was less that of a villainous king, and more a grotesque cautionary tale, a story told beside the fire where listeners would lean close and murmur, "He burned alive," in his own bandages. And perhaps somewhere fate laughed. Not all kings are murdered in secret, nor do all royal deaths come cloaked in the subtle hush of poison or the scream of sudden betrayal in the dark. For some death arrives beneath a sky that knows no mercy in the open square, before the eyes of a restless nation, when the throne itself has cracked beneath the weight of war, and the crown no longer dazzles but divides. And thus it was for Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, who stood alone on the 30th of January, 1649, not as a monarch surrounded by subjects, but as a man condemned by his own people, shivering slightly in the winter wind, waiting for the blade that would separate the anointed head from the body once considered sacred. It had not begun this way, for Charles had been born into majesty, raised with divine right in his blood and ceremony in his every breath, a king who believed down to the marrow of his being that monarchy was not simply power, but providence, that rulers were not elected or permitted, but chosen by God to guide their people like shepherds, guide flocks gently if they can, firmly if they must. And so when Parliament began to stir with ambition and discontent, when voices of reform turned to rebellion, Charles did not see dissent, he saw heresy. And so the kingdom broke. Years of civil war tore through England, splitting it, not just between royalists and parliamentarians, but between father and son, village and town pulpit, and battlefield, until the land was soaked not with ideology, but with the blood of Englishmen who believed themselves to be saving the soul of the nation. And when the smoke cleared and the parliamentarian army stood triumphant under the iron will of Oliver Cromwell, the question remained what to do with a king who would not bow, would not bend, and still claimed his authority as sacred, even with an army at his gates. The answer, shocking then and echoing even now, was this: try him. And so they did. In a trial that shocked monarchies across Europe, Charles was dragged with formality and heavy chains before a court created for the sole purpose of condemning him, a high court of justice assembled not with consent but by force. And though the king refused to recognize its authority, speaking not as a defendant, but as a sovereign, betrayed, they found him guilty, nonetheless, of tyranny, of waging war against his own people, and of crimes against liberty, and the sentence, unthinkable before and almost inconceivable even now, was death. The execution day dawned cold and gray. Charles dressed carefully, choosing 2 shirts instead of 1, not for vanity, but to prevent shivering, for he feared the people would mistake his body's tremble for fear, and he wished to meet death without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him weakened. And as he stepped onto the scaffold, erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London, he carried himself not as a prisoner, but as a man resigned, a king who had lost a kingdom, but not perhaps his own inner crown. He spoke calmly. He declared himself innocent of tyranny, a lover of the people, a defender of true liberty, and when he knelt before the block, placing his neck with deliberate finality upon the cold surface, he extended his arms as the final signal, and the executioner, masked and silent, raised the axe, brought it down, and with a single brutal stroke ended not just a life, but an entire chapter of England's royal history. There was no cheer, no applause. Only the stunned stillness of a crowd that had watched their king die, not in defiance or in secrecy, but with dignity under law, and by the will of men who once bowed before him. And though England would go on without a monarch for 11 uneasy years, the absence of the crown would haunt the land more than its weight ever had, for without Charles, the myth of divine monarchy had died as well. His blood was said to run across the scaffold and freeze into the boards. Later, some whispered it healed those who touched it. But whether miracle or memory, one truth remained: Charles had not been murdered, not exactly. He had been executed like a criminal by men who believed themselves righteous, and in so doing, they had torn open the idea that kings were untouchable, leaving behind a throne that would never quite feel holy again. It is one thing to kill a king, another to assassinate a tyrant, but there is something altogether colder, more unsettling, more haunting, about the quiet erasure of 2 children, barely old enough to carry the weight of a crown, yet dangerous enough in blood and birth to make their existence intolerable to those who coveted the throne they had not yet grown into. And so, in the summer of 1483, in the high stone walls of the Tower of London, 2 boys vanished, not in a blaze of rebellion or amidst the cries of battle, but in silence soft as dust settling on forgotten pages, their fates swallowed by time, yet never truly forgotten. Their names were Edward V, aged 12, and Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, sons of the recently deceased King Edward IV, heirs to the glittering but unstable crown of England, which had passed too often between rival branches during the Wars of the Roses. That long, thorny tangle of blood and ambition between the houses of York and Lancaster, where loyalty was fleeting treachery common, and the line between noble and traitor drawn in pencil, not ink. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in April of that year, his eldest son, the young Prince Edward, was to be crowned king, but he was still a child, and children do not rule alone. And so his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's brother, was appointed Lord Protector, meant to safeguard the realm until the boy came of age. Yet it soon became clear that Richard had no intention of serving behind the throne. For within weeks he moved with swift, decisive authority, intercepting Edward's procession to London, separating the boy from his loyal household, and installing him under the guise of protection in the Tower. At first, no one panicked. The Tower of London, though a fortress, was not yet solely a prison. It was also a royal residence, a place where kings had stayed before coronation, and the presence of the young king within its walls seemed reasonable enough, until a few weeks later his younger brother joined him there, and then quite suddenly the coronation was postponed, and then cancelled. And then Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared that both boys were illegitimate, the result, he claimed, of an invalid marriage between their parents, and by Act of Parliament, the children were disinherited, removed from succession, and Richard himself was crowned king, taking the name Richard III, while the princes, no longer heirs, no longer useful, remained within the Tower, and were seen less and less with each passing day, until they were not seen at all. There was no announcement, no official notice, no funeral procession, or public statement, only the slow, creeping realization that the windows of their apartments no longer flickered with candlelight, that no servant had brought fresh food to their rooms, that the guards once stationed near their chambers had been quietly reassigned, and that no one not noble, not servant, not mother could gain access to the boys, nor account for their presence. Rumors bloomed like mold, that they had been smothered in their sleep by loyal assassins, that they had been starved or drowned or poisoned, that their bodies had been buried in secret beneath stone stairs or tossed into the Thames in the dead of night, that Richard III had ordered it himself or that others had done it for him, hoping to curry favor with a king newly crowned. And though Richard denied all involvement, and no proof was ever laid at his feet with certainty, the cloud never left him. And when he was slain at the Battle of Bosworth 2 years later, his name was already blackened, his reputation already curdled into legend, a hunchbacked usurper, a child killer, a tyrant who had bathed the crown in innocent blood. Centuries later, in 1674, 2 small skeletons were discovered beneath a staircase in the tower, wrapped in velvet roughly the size of young boys. And though they were buried with royal honors in Westminster Abbey, their identities have never been proven beyond doubt. And so the story endures. Not with a sword, not with fire, but with a question. What happened to the princes? Were they killed? If so, by whom? And if not, where did they go? But perhaps the greater question is not how they died, but what it meant that a throne could be so coveted, so dazzling in its power, that 2 children could simply be disappeared. Their voices silenced their names, smeared their fate, transformed into rumor, leaving only an absence behind a quiet, hollow space where 2 young kings might have ruled had history been kinder. There are some deaths that feel like inevitabilities, like storms long gathering on the horizon, that at last break with thunder, and there are others that arrive like an unexpected knock in the quiet of night, unthinkable until they unfold before your eyes. And so it was on the morning of August 1st, 1589, as King Henry III of France sat within the warm candlelight of the Château de Saint-Cloud, weary from years of religious war, wearier still from the burden of a crown that had become a symbol of fracture more than unity, unaware that death was already standing at the door, cloaked in cassocks, and Tansato breathing evenly, quietly, as if in prayer. By the time of his final days, Henry's reign had become a thing strained and fraying at every seam. For France in the late 16th century was not a kingdom so much as a battleground, for belief torn between Catholic League extremists, Huguenot Protestants, and moderate royalists who hoped vainly to hold the middle ground. And Henry, elegant, soft-spoken, famously vain, had never been quite enough of a soldier for the generals, never quite enough of a priest for the church, and far too clever for the mobs who wanted certainty carved in fire and iron. He had already lost his heirless brother Francis, Duke of Anjou, to illness. He had alienated much of the Catholic League by ordering the murder of Henry of Guise, their charismatic leader, in a shocking act of royal brutality inside the very chambers of a council meeting at Blois. An act that did not restore authority, but merely lit the fuse on his own undoing. For the Guise family was beloved, and revenge, when whispered in cathedrals and marketplace corners, is a kind of liturgy in itself. And so it was that a 24-year-old Dominican friar named Jacques Clément, pious and fanatical, convinced that Henry was not merely a flawed king, but an instrument of Satan sent to destroy. The Church came to believe that God himself had placed the dagger in his hand, and with letters of introduction and a deceptive air of humble devotion, he was granted audience with the king alone, as was customary when a man of the cloth sought private confession. The setting was intimate. The candles flickered in the stale summer heat. Henry was seated, tired but courteous, unarmed, and expecting perhaps a whispered appeal for clemency, a plea for peace, or even a request for alms from a devout but impoverished friar. and instead Clément leaned forward, whispered softly into the king's ear, "From the part of the Catholic people I bring you salvation," and then, like the striking of a match, drew forth a dagger from beneath his robes and plunged it into the king's abdomen with a savage, singular thrust. Henry cried out, not a royal proclamation, not a demand for guards, but a stunned, mortal gasp. And as his attendants rushed in, the friar was seized, beaten and killed on the spot, torn apart by blades, and fury his mission fulfilled even as his body crumpled in blood and cloth at the king's feet. The wound was deep. At first, Henry seemed as though he might endure it, even joked weakly with his physicians as they pressed linen to his gut and whispered desperate Latin prayers, but infection set in swiftly, as it so often did in those days, and within hours, the signs of death appeared. The sweating, the glassy eyes, the color draining from his face like wine from an overturned chalice. By the morning of the next day, he was dead. His final act, knowing that his own line, the once mighty House of Valois, would end with him, was to name his Protestant cousin Henry of Navarre as his rightful heir, a decision that would plunge France into still more civil war, but eventually lead to the rise of the Bourbon dynasty, the reluctant conversion of Henry IV to Catholicism, and in time the fragile restoration of peace. But the blade had already done more than pierce flesh. It had transformed the image of the king from ruler to martyr in the eyes of some, and to apostate in the eyes of others. And for years afterward, France would remember not just the war, but the image of a monarch dying by candlelight, not at the hands of generals or treacherous cousins, but by a lone monk righteous in his own mind, who believed God had commanded him to strike down a king. And perhaps in some quiet chamber of heaven or hell, Henry still sits in that candlelight, forever leaning forward, to hear the whisper, forever waiting for the dagger's sting. In the grand catalogue of royal deaths, where poison seethes in goblets and daggers flash beneath cloaks, there is something particularly haunting about the kind of death that leaves no body behind, no tomb, no procession, no certainty. And so the story of Władysław III, boy, King of Poland, crusader, King of Hungary, would end not with a funeral bell, but with a question mark written in blood and sand upon the shores of the Black Sea, where waves still break over the forgotten bones of men and horses, and the wind carries whispers of a monarch who vanished at the edge of empire. He had ascended the Polish throne at the tender age of 10, placed upon the shoulders of chancellors and counselors who spoke for him in the courts of Krakow. And when years later the Hungarian nobles invited him to rule their kingdom too, it was with both crowns upon his brow that Władysław, barely out of adolescence, stood poised against the rising storm of the Ottoman Empire, whose sultans were no longer content to knock at the gates of Europe, but now pushed through them with armies of dazzling power and unshakable faith. It was the Crusade of 1444, one of the last true crusades of Christendom, called not from Rome, but from desperation orchestrated by diplomats, bankers, and priests, who believed they could tame the East with promises, gold, and steel. And though Władysław was young, untested, and possibly manipulated by older men with sharper ambitions, he nonetheless marched proudly beneath the cross, bound by oath and prophecy, to drive the Turks from the Balkans and restore Christendom's fading edge. The armies met at Varna, a small coastal town in what is now Bulgaria, and there, on November 10th, battle was joined fierce, chaotic, blinding, with dust and banners with the Christian coalition facing the might of Sultan Murad II, whose janissaries stood firm behind their crescent-emblazoned shields, unbending as the tide. The battle should have been lost slowly, with honor, retreat, and regret. But Władysław, whether from inexperience or reckless courage, ordered a direct cavalry charge against the Sultan himself, hoping to strike the heart and win the day with a single blow. And for a moment, it seemed he might succeed. He broke through the enemy lines with a small retinue of knights slicing toward the Ottoman tent, like a lightning bolt hurled by Mars, cutting down guards, scattering horses reaching nearly to the foot of the throne itself until one janissary, perhaps unnoticed, perhaps forgotten, in the dust struck back with a scimitar, felling the king Sis with a single terrible stroke that severed his head from his shoulders and cast it into the sea of blood and confusion. Or so the story goes, because no one ever found his body. No relic returned to Krakow. No coffin was laid in state. Only rumors scattered testimonies, contradictions. Some said his head was mounted on a pike and paraded through Ottoman camps, others that the body was decapitated and buried in an unmarked grave at Varna. Still others whispered that he survived wounded, dazed, captured perhaps, and spent the rest of his life hidden far from Europe, either as a prisoner in Anatolia or more fantastically, as a wanderer known as Prince of the East, fighting in secret against the Turks, appearing like a ghost in remote corners of Christendom, forever cloaked in mystery. The Poles and Hungarians mourned, but not conclusively, for how do you grieve a king whose bones you have not seen? How do you bury a name that might still breathe? And so his legend grew. The 3 lives of Władysław became a popular tale in the years to come, the life he lived as a king, the death he died as a hero, and the secret life he might have lived as a man reborn beyond the reach of thrones. And long after the war was lost and the lands he once ruled passed to new dynasties, the story of the king who vanished at the edge of Christian hope remained carried by candlelight into taverns and monasteries, carved onto obscure margins of manuscripts, where monks noted that perhaps he would return one day, cloaked in clouds, to reclaim his sword and finish the charge he began. And so it is that sometimes in the histories of the forgotten and the half-believed, a missing king leaves more weight than a buried one, and Władysław III, whether slain or spared, whether martyr or myth, still stands somewhere in that hazy place between memory and miracle, with a crown that cannot be found and a death that cannot be confirmed. There is a particular kind of intimacy to being killed in one's own chambers, a violation not of territory alone but of trust, of flesh, of the illusion that behind heavy doors and silk-curtained walls, a king might be safe. And so it was on the final day of Wenceslaus III, the last of the Przemyslid dynasty, whose reign ended not in royal fanfare or sweeping tragedy, but in the still air of a private room, where betrayal struck not with an army, but with a dagger, a garrote, and something else no one quite agrees on, for his was a murder of layers, a death with too many hands, too many motives, and too many locked doors to leave only one truth behind. He was only 17 when they killed him, a boy king with 3 crowns upon his brow, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, titular King of Poland, yet barely old enough to grow a beard, a monarch more by inheritance than by strength, more puppet than puppet master, shuffled between palaces and palatinate quarrels by nobles, who saw him not as sovereign, but as leverage in their own tangled ambitions. And though he had renounced the Hungarian throne and never fully claimed Poland, he still stood symbolically and dangerously at the heart of Central Europe's most volatile game of succession. The year was 1306, and Wenceslaus had traveled to the city of Olomouc, a Moravian stronghold, to gather forces for a military expedition, a campaign that might have restored his claims in Poland or reinforced his power in Bohemia. But he never marched from that city, for on the night of August 4th, within the guest residence where he and his retinue were quartered, the future split open with a single scream. The room was small, a warm chamber reserved for bathing and repose, where the steam clung to the tiled walls like breath, and the windows were shut tight against the summer's dust, and no guard stood watch at the inner threshold. For Wenceslaus was relaxing, vulnerable, his sword cast aside, stripped of royal robes, and alone when they came for him. 3 men, perhaps 4, The exact number never confirmed, for the identities of the assassins were never named in court, nor firmly written in the records, only alluded to in passing, by later chroniclers who suggested a Bohemian noble conspiracy, perhaps even with foreign interests, perhaps even with the Queen Dowager herself, Wenceslaus's stepmother, who may have feared the boy's growing independence or sought to preserve her own influence by removing him entirely. And what followed was not a clean death, not a regal execution, not a lone dagger in the dark. It was by every account a frenzy. They stabbed him. They strangled him. They slashed his throat with a knife so viciously that the cut struck bone, and when his attendants, alerted by the noise, finally forced their way into the room, they found his naked body sprawled across the stone floor, blood congealing in the crevices, his limbs contorted, not in peace but in resistance, as though he had fought hard and died harder. And the tiles, still slick from bathwater, made the scene all the more grotesque, a mingling of death and cleansing the sacred, and the brutal collapsing into one. No trial was held. No execution of accomplices. Instead, the kingdom reeled not only from the shock of the murder itself, but from what it meant. The extinction of a royal line for Wenceslaus was the last male of the Przemyslid house, a dynasty that had ruled Bohemia since mythic times, whose ancestors were half legend and half law. And now, with one scream and a blood-soaked bath, the line was broken, and every crown he had worn fell into the hands of rivals who would claim it in war. And so his death became more than a murder. It became a political rupture, the start of new wars, the rise of foreign kings, and the slow unraveling of Bohemia's independence under the pressures of dynastic ambition. Some say his ghost lingers in Olomouc, still a pale boy, with a crown too heavy, drifting barefoot through the corridors, seeking justice in a palace that has long forgotten the sound of his voice. But even in silence, Wenceslaus III reminds us that kings do not always die on the battlefield, and that the most fatal place for a monarch may be within his own walls, where ambition waits behind the doors. Steam curls around the ankles and the blade strikes not just the body, but the memory of a house. There are stories of royal deaths that come in a flash, a blade drawn, a poison, drained, a fall from grace measured in moments. But then there are those that unfold with dreadful slowness, with no single act of violence, but instead a gradual extinguishing of light, a smothering that takes place behind locked doors and whispered prayers. And few such deaths are as cloaked in sorrow and strangeness as that of Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the mighty throne of Spain, who was born to rule but died alone, unseen, unheard, within the frozen stone walls of El Escorial, where even the echoes seem afraid to speak his name too loudly. He was the only surviving son of Philip II of Spain, a king of unyielding devotion and unbending rule, a monarch who measured justice in inches and eternity, whose empire stretched from the silver veins of Peru to the tiled roofs of Lisbon, and who believed with absolute certainty that divine order must never be questioned. And yet into this gilded vision of control was born a son who could not be tamed, could not be shaped, could not be hidden forever, and who seemed from his earliest years not simply rebellious, but unwell in body and possibly worse in mind. Don Carlos limped. He spoke in bursts, sometimes too loud, sometimes too strange, and his moods swung like a bell in a tempest, elated in one breath, howling in the next, and those who served him walked lightly, cautiously, as if his corridors were filled with hidden snares, for no one could be sure whether the prince would smile, scream, or strike without warning. Some blamed the Habsburg blood too tightly wound by generations of cousin marriages, a spiral folding in on itself, while others whispered that his soul had been corrupted, that the devil had taken root where reason should live. But Philip, ever pious, saw only danger in his son's eyes, a chaos that threatened the very idea of order. And as Carlos grew older, stranger, more volatile, the father grew colder, more distant, his glances toward his son becoming calculations, as though measuring how long the kingdom could bear such a burden beneath its future crown. The breaking point came in 1568. There were plots or rumors of them that Don Carlos, in his furious impatience, had conspired to flee Spain, to seize an army, perhaps even to rebel against his own father's rule in the Low Countries, where blood and faith had already turned rebellion into war. And whether those rumors were true or merely convenient, Philip acted with absolute finality. He ordered his son imprisoned. No trial, no proclamation, just silence. And so at 23 years old, the heir to the greatest empire on earth was locked behind thick doors in a sealed chamber of El Escorial, that sprawling stone labyrinth of piety and power, where monks moved like ghosts through corridors that echoed with Latin prayers and military boots. And there, in the cold and narrowing dark, Don Carlos began to vanish. No one was permitted to speak with him. His windows were sealed. His food was passed through slits in the wall. His bed was stripped bare. Some said he was chained. Others claimed he was starved. Still others said he raved and sang at night long after midnight, until his voice cracked and failed. And then 6 months later, without announcement, he was simply dead. No autopsy, no viewing, just the tolling of a bell, the burial of a body few had seen, and the swift resumption of court life as if he had never existed at all. And though Philip insisted that his son had died of natural causes, perhaps a fever, perhaps an infection, no one believed it entirely. Not then, not now, for there was something too precise, too convenient about the timing. The silence, the disappearance of a prince whose very presence had become an inconvenience to the carefully polished mirror of Spanish royalty. In the centuries since, Don Carlos has become legend, portrayed by poets as a tragic soul crushed by tyranny, by dramatists as a madman too dangerous to live, and by historians as the dark question mark in an empire of certainties, but no version of the story, no telling, no opera, no page, no film has ever been able to say with certainty how he died, or why or what exactly happened within those thick walls where the light did not reach. Only this remains: the memory of a prince in a stone tomb that may have been his cradle, and his coffin, a father who ruled an empire yet feared his son, and a voice that once screamed behind doors that no one dared to open. Some kings die with crowns slipping from their brows, others with daggers in their backs. But a few fall in ways so quiet, so drawn out, so full of contradiction, that their deaths become more than endings. They become puzzles, debated and reimagined, not for years, but for millennia. And among them none looms larger, more mythic, more maddeningly unsolved than the death of Alexander III and of Macedon, the man they called Alexander the Great, whose empire stretched from the mountains of Greece to the rivers of India, and who in the prime of life, at the height of glory, was felled not by sword, arrow, or enemy, but by something far more invisible, more insidious, perhaps a single poisoned cup. It was 323 BCE, and Alexander was 32 years old, a man younger than many kings at their coronation, yet already greater than any ruler the world had known. And he stood at last, not upon a battlefield, but in the lush, sweltering palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, in Babylon, that jewel of ancient Mesopotamia, where palm trees lined the courtyards, and peacocks drifted through scented gardens, and where for the first time in years, the great conqueror was not riding toward war, but pausing to dream of new conquests yet to come. Arabia, Carthage, even the mysterious lands west of the ocean's edge. But dreams, like kings, are fragile things. He had just returned from a long campaign in India, a march that had tested even his hardened troops and had nearly broken his army, and though Alexander remained undefeated in battle, His body was no longer untouched by strain. Fevers had come and gone, wounds, old and new, ached in his limbs, and yet the flame in him still burned so brightly that no one expected it to dim so soon. And then during a feast, lavish, loud, filled with music and drink, he took ill. Some say it began with a stabbing pain in his belly, sudden and sharp striking, as he drank a cup of unmixed wine offered by a friend, Medius, a companion of some standing, whose name would be whispered for centuries afterward, though no guilt was ever proven. And from that moment, Alexander declined not all at once, but inch by inch, day by day, over the course of 12 strange and agonizing days. As his fever rose, his voice weakened, and his mighty body, the same body that had crossed deserts and stormed cities, lay sweating and trembling in the darkness. Doctors were summoned, prayers were offered, sacrifices were made, but nothing helped. And soon his generals, those battle-hardened men who had followed him through a decade of fire and conquest, stood helpless by his bedside, waiting, hoping, dreading, as the man who had led them to the ends of the earth now struggled simply to rise from his couch. He whispered final orders. He spoke of unity, and when asked to whom he left his empire, his vast, unmatched dominion, he is said to have breathed just 2 words to the strongest, and then he was gone. Or perhaps not quite. For some say his body did not decay, not for days, not even for a week, as if the very breath of death hesitated, uncertain, unwilling to touch such a man too soon. And this too has fed the fire of speculation. Was he poisoned with a substance so rare, so subtle, that it slowed his heartbeat until he was buried alive? Was it strychnine or arsenic or some long-lost botanical toxin known only to ancient Persian apothecaries, or was it simply typhoid, or malaria, or a ruptured organ, torn by years of hardship? No one can say. His body was sealed in a gold sarcophagus and taken first to Egypt, then vanished, lost to time. And in the centuries since, poets and emperors, scientists and conspirators have all tried to answer the same question: how does the greatest man in history die? Without clarity, without closure, without witness. Perhaps he was murdered by jealous generals. Perhaps he was cursed by vengeful priests. Perhaps he simply collapsed beneath the weight of his own legend. But whatever the cause, Alexander the Great, who never lost a battle, who carved cities from the dust and named them after himself, who dreamed of uniting all the world under one rule, was undone not by enemy spears, but by something small and quiet, a fever, a sip, a shiver, a shadow at the edge of the torchlight. And so the mightiest king in history died, not roaring but whispering, as the empire he had forged began almost immediately to shatter like glass. Some kings fall with swords in hand and cries upon their lips. Others gasp their last amidst treachery and battle cries, but there are some whose deaths arrive softly, like a door being closed in the dark. No blood spilled upon marble, no clanging of armor or crashing of revolt, only silence final and suffocating, as though history itself drew a curtain. And in the case of Henry VI of England, whose reign was marked not by glory, but by grief, not by power, but by piety, the end came not as an explosion, but as an erasure, a vanishing within stone walls where no one was permitted to watch, and from which no voice ever emerged again. He had been king since infancy, crowned not through conquest or inheritance at manhood, but as a baby held in the arms of others, while England watched a crown settle upon a head too small to hold it. And from that moment, it seemed as though Henry's life was one long struggle not to rule, but to endure, caught between factions, pulled by nobles, overshadowed by wars he could not control, and haunted by a legacy that was always too heavy for his timid shoulders. Unlike his predecessors, and unlike the fierce kings who would come after him, Henry VI was not born for the battlefield. He was gentle, scholarly, deeply religious, a man who preferred monasteries to courts, prayers to proclamations, books to banners, and while such virtues might have made him a saint, they made him a dangerous king in an age where strength was survival and where the crown was not only a symbol of divine right, but a prize to be taken by the boldest hand. The kingdom broke around him. First, France was lost. Great swaths of land won by his father, Henry V, were surrendered or retaken by enemies, while Henry drifted in melancholy indecision. Then England itself split as rival factions coalesced into two great houses, Lancaster Henry's own line and York, whose claim to the throne, though once distant, grew sharper with every weakness Henry displayed, and so began the long, brutal conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, where brothers turned upon brothers, and loyalty became a coin too often spent. Through it all, Henry tried to reconcile, to make peace, to pray away the bloodshed. But kings who hesitate become symbols of failure, and soon he was deposed twice, once driven from London, once dragged back to it, held captive by whichever side was winning. At the moment, a hollow king passed between enemies like a forgotten relic, his authority reduced to ceremony, his will broken not by blades, but by the quiet despair of helplessness. And then came May of 1471. The Battle of Tewkesbury had ended in disaster for the Lancastrians. Henry's only son, Prince Edward, had been killed, reportedly cut down after surrendering. Though the truth of that death is as murky as the rest, and with no heir, no army, and no hope, Henry sat imprisoned once more in the Tower of London, a quiet figure in a high chamber, watched by guards, ignored by nobles, already half forgotten by a world that had grown too loud and violent for his quiet faith. And then one night he died. The official account said that he died of grief, that upon hearing of his son's death, the last flicker of his spirit extinguished itself as a candle folds into wax. And perhaps there is some beauty in that image, some tragic poetry in a king who simply could not endure one more sorrow. But others believed otherwise. The new King Edward IV had re-seized the throne just days before. Henry, though powerless, was still a symbol, a rallying point for rebellion, and in an age where symbols were dangerous. Removing him quietly would be far more efficient than risking another uprising. And so it was said, even at the time, that Henry had not died of grief at all, but had been murdered, likely stabbed through the chest, as he knelt in prayer or smothered with a pillow in his sleep, his body shown to the public too quickly for questions to take root. No proof was ever given, no assassin ever named. But the suspicion remained hanging over Edward's reign like a shadow that never quite receded. And centuries later, when Henry's body was exhumed in 1910, examiners noted the presence of skull damage, perhaps inflicted by a blow or perhaps imagined for history, has a way of warping itself to match our fears. What is certain is this: Henry VI, the quiet king, the dreaming king, the king who wanted only peace, was likely killed for the danger of being remembered, and his death, soft as it may seem, was the final punctuation to a reign defined by sorrow, a whisper that echoes still in the cold chambers of the tower, where sometimes, it is said, you can hear the sound of weeping just before dawn. So now, as the pages of these terrible stories begin to turn more slowly, as the torchlight flickers across the corridors of memory where 10 kings have fallen, in 10 dreadful ways, you might begin to sense something deeper rising beneath the names and daggers and poisoned cups, a shadow that is not merely made of individual malice or singular betrayal, but of something larger, more ancient, and more inevitable. The truth that to be a king in any century, in any palace wearing any kind of crown, is not to be the safest man in the kingdom, but rather the most vulnerable, the one most exposed to the secret hatreds, silent ambitions, and waiting blades of those who walk just behind the throne. For when you examine these deaths, slow and sudden, brutal and bloodless, public and private, you begin to see not a collection of unique tragedies, but a recurring pattern, a rhythm to regicide, a grim logic in the machinery of monarchy that seems to say the higher you rise, the more perfect your aim must be for even the smallest. Falter will draw the wolves close, and even the most glorious crown casts a shadow long enough to hide an assassin within it. And it does not matter in the end what kind of king you were. Were you like James, I of Scotland, clever and reforming, whose death came in a sewer with iron nails sealing his escape because he pushed too hard against the power of nobles and forgot that a throne built on feudal bones still has teeth? Or like Charles the Bad, cruel and cunning, whose decades of betrayal left him so loathed that his burning death wrapped in brandy-soaked bandages felt less like a tragedy and more like the world laughing last? Or Charles I of England, regal and proud, whose head fell in daylight, not from stealth, but from principle slain, not in vengeance, but by verdict, a man who believed too strongly in divine right, and not enough in mortal limits. And what of the children of Edward V and Richard, the vanished princes, whose very existence was threat enough to vanish them from history without a trace? Or the young Wenceslas stabbed and strangled and slashed in his bath, undone not by rebellion, but by proximity, by the simple danger of being too close to ambition, too young to defend against it? Do you see it now, whether it is a monk with a dagger whispering prayers in Henry III's ear, or a father sealing a cell door on his own blood as Don Carlos screams in the dark, or a boy king like Władysław III riding headlong into battle only to vanish beneath the sea-sprayed chaos and leave behind a kingdom without a body? The outcome is the same. Not one of them was safe. Not even Alexander the Great, greatest of them all, who conquered every known army, and still could not survive one final sip of wine or fever or fate. For what was it that killed him truly? The poison, the gods, the loneliness? Or was it simply the weight of everything he had dared to reach for? And then finally, Henry VI, the quiet king, the holy king, who did not rage or command or scheme, who simply prayed and wept and hoped for peace only to be smothered when the peace he longed for proved too dangerous to allow for even harmless kings. It seems must be eliminated lest someone remember them kindly and raise a banner in their name. So here we are. 10 deaths. 10 crowns dropped, cracked, crushed, or carried off in silence. 10 kings whose bodies fell, but whose stories refuse to lie still. And the thread that binds them is not just ambition, or treachery, or even history. It is fear. The fear that lives in every palace wall, that walks behind every throne, that sleeps beneath every royal bed. The fear that no matter how high one climbs, there is always someone just behind, watching, waiting, and whispering that you do not belong there. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all that the crown does not protect. It never has. It never will. It simply marks the head it rests upon for worship, yes, but also for the axe. Long after the dagger has been drawn, long after the poison cup has cooled on the banquet table, or the last bootstep has faded from the executioner's platform, long after the sword has fallen, or the scream has quieted behind the stone walls of some forgotten tower, there remains hanging over history like smoke that refuses to lift the uneasy legacy of regicide, the strange and shifting echo that such a death leaves behind, not only in politics, but in memory, in story, in the way a kingdom chooses to forget or remember the one who wore the crown last. Because a king's death, when it comes unnaturally, violently, or too soon, is never just the end of a man's life. It is the beginning of a struggle for the meaning of that life. Did he die a martyr, cut down for his virtue? a soul too noble for the savage world around him? Did he die a tyrant rightly removed by a people seeking justice? Was he a victim of circumstance crushed beneath powers he could not understand? Or simply a man flawed and mortal who happened to be standing in the wrong place wearing the wrong crown at the wrong time? You see it in the way they rewrite the names. Charles I, who died beneath an English sky, to the steady beat of justice's drum, became a saint to some, a usurper to others, and a symbol to all, not because of how he lived, but because of how he died clean and public royal blood, staining the snow like ink spilled on parchment, so that the revolution could write something new. You see it in Alexander, whose death was so opaque, so unsatisfying, that the world refused to let him go quietly, spinning tales of poisoning, of betrayal, of divine punishment, until his final days became a mirror into which every generation could peer and see a different reflection of ambition brought low. You see it most vividly in the princes in the tower, who were so thoroughly erased from the world that their very absence became louder than their lives ever had been. Because when a king dies, and there is no grave, no witness, no last word, the silence itself becomes suspicious, becomes sacred, becomes a story the people keep telling just to fill the void. But it is not only memory that reshapes after a royal death. It is power too raw, rattled, restless power trying to reassert itself in the aftermath, trying to build a throne atop the ashes of another, trying to seal the wound before it festers into rebellion. That is why kings' killers, whether cloaked in legality or lurking in shadows, almost always move quickly. They bury fast. They silence faster. They crown the next heir before the body is cold, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity, because power cannot afford a vacuum. And a murdered king leaves behind not only grief, but opportunity, and in courts filled with men who have waited too long for their moment. Nothing is more dangerous than the pause between monarchs. And still, even the swiftest succession cannot stop the ghosts from stirring. They haunt not just castles and towers, but the minds of those who follow kings, who wonder if they too might vanish into the same shadows, who walk with a little more caution, sit a little less comfortably on the throne, knowing somewhere deep that their authority is not eternal, not sacred, not truly secure, but conditional, precarious, held only so long as no one dares to challenge it. Because once a king has been murdered, once one crown has fallen to the floor and shattered it, becomes easier for another to fall, and then another. And each new death dulls the magic a little more until the throne, once divine, once unshakable, begins to seem like any other chair, just a place for a man to sit, until someone stronger pulls him down. And that is the true cost of regicide. Not the blood, not the body, but the erosion of the illusion, the gradual unraveling of the idea that kings are chosen by fate or gods or destiny, and the creeping realization, whispered first in corners and then louder, that they are men and that men can be removed, replaced, forgotten, rewritten. And so every murdered king in some way murders monarchy itself, just a little. And what begins as one man's death becomes a ripple across centuries, a scar across symbols, a reminder that even the tallest crown casts a shadow you can slip a knife through. For no king truly dies when the blood runs cold and the eyes fade shut. For no crown truly falls, only to rest in the earth or vanish into the vaults of a successor's coronation. The end of a king's life is only the beginning of his afterlife, in story, in shadow, in whispered rumor and written word, and it is there in plays, in poems, in epics, in chronicles, more imaginative than factual, that the murdered monarch finds his most enduring throne, not in the annals of government, but in the dreams and dramas of a world that refuses to let such deaths go quietly into dust. Because the crown, as much as it is a piece of metal, is also a narrative device, and those who wore it and fell from it become symbols, not just men turned by the alchemy of ink and memory into objects of tragedy, of horror, of caution, or of romance, and the truth, however sharp and bloodied, begins to twist, not to deceive but to deepen, to become something more than it was, to serve a new purpose in the minds of those who need kings, to be more than mere history. Consider the trembling figure of Richard II, deposed and imprisoned. Shakespeare's verses, breathing into him the delicate sorrow of a man who believed in divine right and died by mortal force. A king who gazes at his reflection and asks not what will become of me, but what is a king truly if he can be undone by such common hands? And though the historical Richard's fall was complex, strategic, and filled with political nuance, the literary Richard becomes a mirror not only of himself, but of every sovereign who forgets that the crown sits on the head, but not always in the heart of the people. Or take Macbeth, who is not even a victim, but a murderer king, and yet the story is not merely about a tyrant's rise and fall, but about what power does to the soul. How ambition once awoken becomes a disease. How the throne that promised greatness becomes a prison of guilt, blood, and ghost-ridden nightmares. And though the real Macbeth was a relatively competent ruler remembered with less venom than one might think, it is Shakespeare's twisted version that lives on immortal accursed, still mumbling through the fog of heath and hallucination. And what of Julius Caesar, stabbed not for evil, but for fear of what he might become, his murder less a judgment than a preventative strike by men who claimed to love Rome more than they loved loyalty, and yet in dying he becomes greater than he was in life. His ghost wandering the stage, his name echoing louder in death than in all the triumphs he achieved. For what is et tu brute, if not the ultimate line of every betrayed ruler? Whether it was spoken or not, then, there is the case of the princes in the tower, whose story has become so fogged with fiction that the facts themselves almost vanish, and in their place rise stories of smothered innocence of spectral children, wandering castle halls of Richard III, painted by pen and play as a hunchbacked villain so archetypal that it is hard now to know where propaganda ends and identity begins. Because once a death becomes story, truth becomes a character, and it is no longer required to be correct, only compelling. Even Don Carlos, mad Prince of Spain, becomes in Schiller's hands a misunderstood martyr in Verdi's opera, a voice of romantic rebellion. His slow death in El Escorial transformed from political erasure into tragic opera, a symbol of freedom crushed beneath the heel of absolute power. And perhaps this is the mercy of fiction, that it lets the condemned speak again, lets their ghosts sing, rage, love, and be remembered not only for how they died, but for who they could have been. For kings may fall by the sword or the sickness, by betrayal or decree, but in legend they rise again, reshaped and retold until they no longer belong to history, but to everyone, to the boy who reads of Arthur's last stand, to the actor who dons a crown and staggers across the stage, to the whisperers who say, "Dill, did you know they never found Władysław's body?" And so the cycle goes on. Kings die, but their deaths live. Because we do not bury them in the ground. We bury them in story, in song, in symbol, and in doing so we crown them once more, not in gold, but in myth. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to imagine a king as a creature of comfort, robed in velvet, surrounded by perfumed courtiers, seated beneath vaulted ceilings and chandeliers where light pools like honey issuing decrees with a flick of the hand, feasting beneath tapestries and waking to music in the morning. But beneath that illusion, beneath the gold and pageantry and obedient silence of the court, there pulsed always a more ancient and more private rhythm, the slow, anxious heartbeat of fear, the knowledge that power once taken must be defended not only with law and armies, but with sleepless nights and sharpened senses, for the crown did not simply elevate the head. It marked, it placed it in the crosshairs of ambition, vengeance, madness, and whispered plots and kings, though surrounded by guards, were rarely safe from the thing that frightened them most, those closest to them. Because kings, like all men, sleep, but unlike all men, they sleep surrounded by others who have something to gain if they never wake again. Even in the most fortified palaces, it was understood that danger did not come crashing through the gates in the dead of night. It slipped through the doors in silence in the form of a trusted chamberlain, a cupbearer, a cousin, a priest, or a servant, with keys to every room. And so monarchs developed rituals of paranoia so precise they could pass for devotion. Food tasters, hidden passageways, nightly relocations from one chamber to another. Guards sworn not only to loyalty, but to silence, and above all, the constant humming awareness that every mirror might reflect not only one's face, but the glint of a blade. Consider the case of Richard III, who, after seizing the throne under a cloud of controversy and the suspicious disappearance of his young nephews, slept in the inner chambers of castles only after securing multiple layers of locks, bolts, and personally appointed guards, and who still, despite such precautions, rode into battle, wearing not only his armor, but the certainty that betrayal would follow him into the field, for once the crown had been taken by force. It could be taken from him in the same way. Or Philip II of Spain, cold-eyed and calculated, who walked the cloisters of El Escorial, with the ghost of his dead son behind every door, a man who trusted no one, not even his own blood, and who filled his palace with priests and walls, as if he could build a kingdom that only God could enter. And yet even he, master of empire, could not protect himself from the memory that it was his signature, not another's, that consigned Don Carlos to slow starvation in silence. And what of Henry IV of France, who survived a dozen assassination attempts before falling to a fanatic's dagger in the street, despite armored coaches and guards on horseback, and who in his final years took to disguising himself among the common people of Paris, not out of affection, as legend would later suggest, but out of fear that he was no longer truly king, but merely the last man seated in a room where chairs were always being taken away. Even kings with reputations for cruelty, perhaps especially those kings, lived with the certainty that their violence had planted seeds in the hearts of others. Seeds that might one day blossom into vengeance for what tyrant does not imagine. Eventually, the hand that comes to avenge what he has done, a servant carrying not supper, but the reckoning. They built secret staircases, developed coded signals, surrounded themselves with favorites and flatterers, and yet none of it mattered. In the end, not really, for kings live in houses of glass, where the very nature of their authority invites not only obedience, but resentment, envy, and ambition disguised as reverence. And if a king ruled too well, he bred fear. If too poorly, he bred hatred. And if he did both, he guaranteed that someone somewhere would be counting his steps, measuring his words, waiting for the moment when the crown slipped just enough for a hand to strike. And so they lived never alone, yet never truly among friends. They dined at long tables but tasted little. They smiled for courtiers while watching their eyes. They gave titles to those they secretly suspected, and blessings to those they could not afford to offend. And when they closed their eyes at night, if they dared to close them at all, they listened for footsteps, for rustling cloth, for the shift of a blade against a scabbard just outside the door. Because to be a king was to be hunted not always with swords, but always with silence, and the fear behind the throne was not madness, but memory, the memory that kings always fall. Though the blade may fall upon the neck of the king, it is often the queen who first hears the silence that follows, who feels the chill spread through the corridors before the courtiers know what has happened, who reads the faces of men long before they draw their daggers, and while history records the fates of kings in battles and executions and whispered poisonings, it so often forgets the women beside them who watched these deaths unfold with eyes that could not look away, and who were left afterward not only to mourn, but to navigate the wreckage to survive the bloodshed that spared their bodies, but not their lives. Because a queen is never truly a bystander. She is a symbol, a witness, a pawn, a player, sometimes all in the same breath, and whether she loved her husband or loathed him, whether she stood beside him in public or behind him in private. The death of a king shattered her world too, and left her to either retreat, remain, or rise. Consider Joan Beaufort, Queen of Scotland, who stood in the cold chambers of Perth while James I, her husband, was butchered by nobles in a sewer tunnel, stabbed again and again, while she screamed and bled herself wounded, trying to reach him. And who, once the horror had passed and the conspirators had fled, did not crumple into grief, but gathered her strength, summoned allies, and turned her mourning into vengeance so complete that men were torn apart in public squares to satisfy the throne's insult, a widow not content to wear black, but to rule in red. And what of Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort of France, who witnessed not one but multiple assassinations and attempted murders in her lifetime, whose sons died or were murdered or failed to rule, and who in the midst of chaos used her position as Dowager Queen not to weep, but to outmaneuver cardinals and generals, to whisper in ears and press signets into soft wax, a master of survival in a court, drenched with blood, a woman blamed for plots but never proven guilty because power that passes through a queen's hands leaves no fingerprints, only consequences. Then there is the image of Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, whose quiet dignity at court masked growing fury, as her husband favored his male companions over her, neglected the crown's duties, and steered the kingdom toward ruin. And who, when her moment came, crossed the sea with an army, and a lover seized her husband's power, deposed him, and may well have overseen or permitted his death, a whispered suffocation or a story too vulgar to retell. And whether she killed him or not, the message was clear: queens could end kings, not only mourn them. And yet there were queens who were left with nothing but silence. Elizabeth Woodville, mother of the princes in the Tower, who watched her sons taken from her first to the Tower, then into legend, and who locked away in sanctuary and grief could do nothing but wait, her sorrow turned into rumor, her name into a chess piece in Tudor diplomacy, her motherhood into a question mark written in royal ink. Or Anne Neville, Queen to Richard III, whose brief reign was haunted by whispers of vanished nephews and cursed ambition, and who faded from the court almost as quickly as she entered it, sickly sorrowful and powerless to stop the blood from rising around her husband's feet. And yet for every queen who watched the blade fall, there were those who lifted it, if not by hand, then by word, by absence, by quiet complicity. For queens, too, made choices, forged alliances, burned letters, and offered smiles with double meanings. And though they rarely gave the order, they could clear the path, and their knowledge of the court of its chambers. And gossip was often more deadly than any sword. Because to be a queen was to know everything, and say nothing, to be both ornament and strategist, to survive a husband's death, not only with dignity, but with calculation. And whether she became regent prisoner or queen mother, she carried the memory of the king's death inside her, a wound she could never show, but which bled into every word she spoke afterward. And so we must remember that when a king dies, especially when he dies by betrayal, violence, or silence, there is always a woman in the room or just outside the door who sees the end not as a tragedy, but as a beginning. When a king is murdered, the kingdom does not merely shift, it shudders, it stares, and it waits to see who will rise, who will step forward and lift the crown from the floor, where it has fallen still, sticky with blood, still echoing with the cries of a death that history may not yet understand, and more often than not, it is not a warlord or a general or a brother who claims it first, but a child wide-eyed, silent, staring up at courtiers who now kneel too quickly, at guards who look twice before speaking, at mothers who hold them too tightly. And so begins a life not of majesty, but of inheritance shaped by fear of boyhood, drowned in duty of waking each day in a palace that still smells like loss. Because to be the son of a slain king is not to inherit a legacy, it is to inherit a murder, a crime no one wants to name aloud, but which saturates every corridor, every ceremony, every glance from old men who served your father and now serve you, their loyalty too fast, their voices too polished, their silence too deep. Consider James II of Scotland, who was only 6 years old when his father James I was ambushed and butchered in a monastery sewer. His cries echoing through the tunnels as he tried to escape through a passage that had in bitter irony been sealed to stop tennis balls from going astray. And so young James was lifted onto the throne not in triumph, but in trauma crowned amidst vengeance and chaos raised not by parents, but by regents, wardens, and counselors, some of whom may have known the plot, and all of whom whispered while he played with wooden swords, that one day he too would have to avenge or fall. Or think of Edward IV's children, particularly Edward V, the boy king, who never ruled, who was taken to the Tower for his protection and never emerged again. And how his younger brother Richard followed him in silence, their names removed from the line of succession. Their future stolen not by war, but by absence, by the simplicity of being too young to defend themselves and too important to be left alive. And if they did not understand what was happening, perhaps that was the final cruelty, that their royalty made them dangerous before they even knew what danger was. There is also the case of Henry VI, who came to the throne as an infant after the death of Henry V, a warrior king whose shadow was so large that his son never escaped it. A child raised in a kingdom still echoing with military triumph, but governed by compromise and fear. A boy whose shy manner and soft speech could not hold together the great machine he had inherited, and whose eventual collapse into periods of catatonia seemed less like madness and more like surrender to a burden he had never asked to carry. And what of Don Carlos, son of Philip II, who lived not after his father's death, but during his rule, and whose very existence as heir, as obstacle, as mirror of instability, was so feared that he was locked away by the same man who had fathered him and allowed to wither behind doors, a royal child consumed not by his own hunger for power, but by the hunger of others to keep him from it. These children, these inheritors of death, are crowned not in gold but in suspicion, and their reigns are rarely long or peaceful or remembered for anything but the tragedy they walked out of. Because when you begin your rule surrounded by blood-stained flags with whispers in every corner, and eyes that remember the father more fondly than they look upon the son, it is almost impossible not to become either a vengeful ruler or a haunted one, or more often both. They are taught caution before courage, distrust before diplomacy, and long before they learn to give orders, they have already learned to watch every mouth that smiles at them, to weigh every word, to fear every gift. For they know without being told that the blade that fell once can fall again, and that crowns, no matter how finely worked, sit lightly on heads born from violence. And thus the children of murdered kings grow not toward sunlight, but toward survival, and some like saplings bent by storm, straighten over time, and learn to rule with firmness and grace. But many remain twisted, their roots sunk deep into shadow, destined to repeat the sorrow they were born into, or to die before ever escaping it. In the final moment of a king's life, when the breath hangs still in his chest, and the world narrows to a chamber, a scaffold, a battlefield, or a candlelit corridor, there is always someone standing near a man, sometimes a woman, perhaps masked, perhaps trembling, perhaps eerily calm. And it is this figure, this shadow in motion, who becomes not a legend, not a ruler, not a saint or a martyr, but simply the one who does what others only dream or fear, the one who crosses the threshold from thought to act, from silence to violence, and in that instant becomes the unmaking of a crown. Whether they were paid, coerced, faithful, vengeful, or simply obedient. These are the hands that shook or did not shake before reaching out to end what centuries of ceremony had built. And though their names are rarely carved in stone, their fingerprints are left on the pages of history in blood and rumor and fear. Some, like the masked headsman who brought down the axe on Charles I, performed their role with ritual and rhythm, draped in cloth, not to hide their guilt, but to shield their identity from reprisal for killing a king even when ordered by law, even when backed by parliament, or proclaimed righteous by a crowd, was still seen as a crime against divinity. And so the man who lifted the blade did so with precision, not passion, and then stepped down from the scaffold into anonymity, into legend, into silence. Others, like Jacques Clément, the Dominican friar, who plunged a dagger into the gut of Henry III of France, came with faith, not doubt, believing utterly and fatally that God had called him to remove a tyrant, that by killing a king he was serving heaven, not earth. And so he hid the blade beneath his robes, passed through guards with holy words on his lips, and struck in the stillness of private council, not for coin, but for conviction, a martyr to some, a madman to others, but always the pivot on which the kingdom turned. And there were those who killed not as agents of faith or law, but as instruments of power servants, whose daggers followed orders given in whispers, whose silence was bought or forced or expected like a debt long owed to the crown, or the cause, or the man who held the leash. Such were the ones who crept into chambers late at night to smother the sleeping king, who lowered themselves into tunnels to corner a sovereign in retreat, who poured powder into the wine or set fire to the bedchamber, and who vanished again into the court, indistinguishable from the rest. Sometimes it was a stranger. Sometimes it was a brother. Sometimes it was no one at all. And history is left only with a corpse and a theory and the knowledge that someone somewhere knew what happened and chose never to say. And what of those whose job it was not once but always to kill, the executioners men feared and shunned necessary, but despised, who took life not by treachery but by appointment, who rehearsed the weight of the axe, who studied the grain of the block, who learned the names of kings but did not use them, who bowed before the swing and vanished afterward, their faces remembered only in nightmares and courtroom sketches. And what did they think, these men of ritual death, when the one beneath their blade wore a crown? Did they flinch? Did they hesitate, or did they remind themselves again and again that even a king has a neck? It is easy to imagine these figures as villains, easy and often incorrect, for the truth is that they were rarely the authors of the crime. Only its final punctuation, its sharpened exclamation mark, while the real killers, the plotters, the whisperers, the nobles in velvet robes, stood behind curtains and iron gates, with clean hands and careful smiles, already preparing to write the history that would excuse or erase or redefine what had just been done. And so the hands that killed kings are rarely remembered with clarity. They are blurred by time, by politics, by myth. But they were there. They always are. And whether they were shaking or steady, young or old, loyal or lost, they did what history required in its darkest chapters. They ended the king, and with him ended 1,000 hopes, fears, laws, and futures, all in a single moment, a single breath, a single downward motion of the blade. When a king dies, and the soul, if such a thing exists, has fled the flesh. It is not the crown or the throne that is touched first, but the body still warm perhaps, or already stiffening, lying in its bed, or its blood, or its shroud, suddenly still in a world that has revolved around it for years, or decades, or centuries in memory. And it is in that moment, that strange hour of sudden vulnerability, that we see how fragile monarchy truly is, for no matter how divine, no matter how feared or revered the man once was, the dead king's body becomes at last a thing to be handled. And what to do with a king's corpse That has always been the question, whispered in chambers, still echoing with last gasps, debated in courts where no one wants to speak too loudly, for fear of seeming too eager, too disloyal, too ready to move on. For there is power in the body, in who touches it, who guards it, who parades it, hides it, burns it, or buries it. And across history, the bodies of murdered kings have been treated with reverence, with fear, with indifference, and with shocking brutality, depending not only on how they died, but how those who remained wished to be remembered for what came next. Some kings were given burials fit for gods. Alexander the Great, embalmed in honey and sealed in gold, his corpse carried in a jeweled sarcophagus across deserts and rivers, like a relic of Olympus, not a man, but a myth. His body fought over by generals who believed that possessing his remains meant possessing his legacy. And yet that most sacred of corpses vanished. Its final resting place lost to time, looted, relocated, or hidden so deeply that no man since has touched the bones of the man who once touched the edge of the known world. Others were treated less kindly. Charles thus is beheaded by order of a court that called itself just, was not given the pomp of a royal funeral, but buried quietly in St. George's Chapel, without procession, without public grief, watched only by a handful of loyal attendants who feared to draw attention, his head sewn back onto his body, as if dignity could be repaired with thread. And for decades, even centuries, his grave was unmarked, as though to admit where he lay was to admit that a nation had once slain its own king in daylight. Some were burned by accident or design. Charles the Bad, his body wrapped in alcohol-soaked linens for healing, perished in flames and was reduced to ash before his attendants could undo their error. And though he was still a king, there was no glory in his death, and his body was disposed of quickly, his name a cautionary tale rather than an honored memory. And what of the kings whose bodies were never found? Władysław III, vanishing at the Battle of Varna, said to have been decapitated in the melee, but whose remains were never recovered. His head allegedly taken as a trophy, his body perhaps buried in haste or lost beneath the sea. And so his story becomes one of absence, where the missing corpse becomes more powerful than any tomb. A question carved deeper into time than any epitaph could ever hold. Then there are those whose bodies were displayed proofs of death trophies of revolution, like Louis XVI, whose severed head was shown to the crowd, so they could see that the old order had truly ended, or the bodies of traitor kings hung quartered and sent to the four corners of the realm to warn others that crowns were no defense against steel. And yet even in death, kings were rarely left alone. Tombs were broken. Graves exhumed. Henry VI, murdered quietly in the Tower, was later reburied, and when his tomb was opened, centuries later, his skull showed signs of damage, perhaps confirming the rumors of violence. Or perhaps not, for even in death, the truth remained elusive, subject to interpretation, retelling, and the long shadows of politics. Because the royal corpse is not just a body, it is a symbol, a site of power, a relic, a threat, a comfort, or a warning. And those who touch it, guard it, parade it, or erase it, are doing more than moving flesh from one place to another. They are shaping memory, wielding narrative, claiming legitimacy in a world where bones can speak louder than words. And so the final fate of a king's body is never simply burial. It is the last act of control, the final punctuation in the story of power, not a full stop, but a gesture telling the world not only that the king is dead, but what we should believe that death meant. A crown once cast down is rarely left in the dust for long, for though the blood of kings may be washed away, and their names recast in whispers and cautionary tales, the institution they embodied, the court, the pageantry, the throne itself, is too deeply woven into the fabric of power to be discarded with one death, no matter how brutal. And so again and again across history, we see that even the most shocking regicides are followed not by collapse, but but by reassembly, a deliberate and often uneasy return to monarchy, reimagined just enough to seem new, but still rooted in the same soil that once gave birth to the fallen king. Because people, whether nobles hungry for order or commoners weary of uncertainty, do not always rebel to destroy the idea of kingship, but often to reshape it, to clear the path for another head, to wear the crown more obediently, more wisely, more favorably, aligned with their vision of governance or glory. And so when a king dies by treachery or trial or silent strangulation, in the tower the throne is rarely left empty, but rather polished, softened, and offered to the next in line, who steps forward with a blend of reverence and self-preservation, knowing full well what happened to the last man who sat there. Take the case of England, that restless land of roses and blades, where the execution of Charles I in 1649 was not the end of kingship, but merely its pause as the interregnum of Oliver Cromwell rose like a tide austere and joyless, only to recede a few years later into the arms of monarchy once again, when Charles II returned, not as a conqueror, but as a compromise welcomed back in 1660, under terms that clipped the wings of absolutism, but left the skeleton of kingship intact. And so the throne endured, transformed by fire, but still standing, still gold. And then there is France, where the decapitation of Louis XVI in 1793 seemed at first to signal the permanent death of monarchy, replaced by republic, by terror, by a vision of liberty sharp enough to slice through centuries of tradition. And yet after chaos and bloodshed, and the rise and fall of Napoleon, the Bourbons returned in 1814, restored like antique furniture to a house freshly painted. Their authority fragile, yes, but still cloaked in ermine and ritual, because the people had learned once again that removing a king is far easier than agreeing on who should govern instead. In Russia, too, the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in a basement in 1918, bullets echoing through a moment meant to kill not only a man, but a dynasty, a culture, a vision of the sacred, did not prevent the Romanovs from being canonized decades later by the very church they once ruled, nor did it keep monarchist sentiment from lingering beneath the surface of exile communities and nostalgic hearts, where the dream of the Tsar never quite died, only waited in exile in rumor and symbol. Even in Spain, where monarchy was abolished and restored and abolished again across the 20th century, the eventual recrowning of Juan Carlos I after Franco's dictatorship showed that the crown could be repurposed, worn not as an emblem of absolute rule but as a stabilizing talisman, a symbol of continuity in a nation still trembling from its own wounds. And though the king ruled now more by gesture than decree, it was rule nonetheless, proving once more that monarchies may be beheaded but not always buried. Because monarchy, for all its fragility, is strangely durable, not because kings are invincible, but because kingship is useful. And those who hold real power are often willing to revive the crown as long as it serves a purpose to unite, to distract, to sanctify, or to soothe. And so we see again and again that after the murder of a king, there comes not only grief and reckoning, but negotiation, and eventually, the slow return of robes of oaths of coronation music, echoing through cathedrals that once smelled of treason. And it is in this return, careful, ceremonial, and rarely free of tension, that the crown proves itself not merely an ornament of power, but a survivor of it. It changes shape, it changes hands, but it remains. When the blade has fallen, and the silence has settled, and the crown has been swept from the floor, when the banners are lowered, and the bodies buried, or hidden, or burned, what remains after the gasps and cheers and trembling is not just a changed kingdom, but a story. An account that must be told and retold, shaped and sharpened like a ceremonial dagger of its own, for no king can be murdered without consequence, and no throne taken without someone somewhere deciding how it will all be remembered, and so begins the quieter, more deliberate work of national memory, of monuments raised or removed, of myths repeated until they feel like fact, of silences stretched until they disguise themselves as reverence. For the killing of a king is never only about the man. It is about what the man represented, what the nation feared or hoped or hated in him. And in his absence, the people who remain must make a choice to condemn him, and thereby justify his end, to mourn him, and thereby romanticize the past, or to erase him as if the very memory of royal murder were dangerous enough to ignite rebellion once again. And across history, we see that most nations do not choose just one path, but all three in shifting layers of time, ideology, and need. Consider England, where Charles I, executed by his own subjects, in a spectacle of law and defiance, became both villain and martyr in the years that followed, with his enemies calling him a tyrant, a man who pushed his people too far with taxes and arrogance, and his followers calling him a saint, a sovereign who died rather than betray his divine right. And so it was that statues were torn down, then re-erected. Churches rang mourning bells or refused to ring them at all. And January 30th, the date of his death, was once a public fast day, then quietly forgotten, then remembered again by royalists, who laid wreaths where the scaffold once stood, as if memory itself could be scaffolded and dismantled like woodwork. Or think of France, where the death of Louis XVI, carried out beneath the blade of the guillotine, in the cold clarity of Republican justice, was first commemorated with raucous celebration. Wine-flowed crowds cheered, and the revolution claimed it had slain not a man, but a monster. And yet, within a few short decades, the winds shifted, the guillotine was hidden away like a guilty weapon, and a chapel was built on the spot where his head fell, with marble tablets and Latin prayers and trembling candles, as if the nation itself could not decide whether it had liberated itself or simply stained its soul in a way that would never quite wash out. In Russia, the fate of Nicholas II and his family, shot in a basement, their bodies burned with acid and buried in secret, became a story so heavy with grief, guilt, and distortion that it passed into whispered folklore, then denial, then cautious confession, until at last, decades later, his bones were recovered and he was canonized by the Orthodox Church, declared not just a monarch, but a passion-bearer, a holy victim of revolution, whose face now hangs in icons beside martyrs and saints. And yet, even as his tomb draws pilgrims, others still quietly defend his execution as a necessary, if brutal, act to end the old world and begin the new. Even in places where kings were merely rumored to have died, such as Władysław III, whose body was never found. Monuments have been raised, not to what happened, but to what might have happened. And in that ambiguity, legends bloom, statues cast in bronze plaques, etched in old script poems recited by school children, all speaking of loyalty and loss of courage and mystery, of a king who may have died or may have wandered still unburied and unbroken. And so it is that regicide, perhaps the most taboo of political acts, becomes in time ritualized, reinterpreted, or buried in layers of official language and tourist signage until the scaffold is replaced by a museum placard, the blood by velvet rope, and the tale itself becomes a part of the heritage it once tried to sever, because nations cannot live in a constant scream. And so they soften the memory, sculpt it into something manageable, something visitable, something that no longer burns when touched. But beneath it all, beneath the monuments, beneath the plaques, beneath the guided tours and candlelit services and red wreaths, lies the unchanging fact that once in that place the most powerful man in the land was brought to his knees and killed. And no matter how polished the stone or polite the inscription, the ground remembers. In an age when the crown was not simply worn, but anointed, when the monarch was believed to rule not by skill or popularity, but by the mysterious will of God. To kill a king was not just to unmake a ruler, it was to wound the heavens, to break the link between earth and the divine, to shatter something that had been woven supposedly in the mind of the Almighty himself. And so, the death of a monarch, especially when violent or unexplained, was never seen merely as a political upheaval, but as a moment of cosmic significance, an event that demanded not only earthly justice, but spiritual interpretation. Because if God had placed the king upon the throne, if his body had been touched by holy oil, his crown blessed by bishops, his rule proclaimed with incense and scripture, then how when that same body was hacked apart, poisoned, strangled, or vanished in silence, was one to explain such a fall without invoking divine anger or at the very least divine indifference? Some answered with judgment. The king had sinned. The king had failed. He had ruled unjustly, broken covenants, oppressed the people, profaned the altar, taxed the poor, or turned his back on the church. And so his death, no matter how cruel or cowardly, was seen not as treason, but as retribution, an earthly punishment allowed or even directed by heaven to restore the moral balance that kings themselves were meant to uphold. Such was the language whispered after the fall of Charles I of England, whose executioners declared not only legal but theological authority, claiming he had betrayed God's people and become a man of blood, and though the Church of England would later sanctify him, would drape him in the robes of martyrdom, and dedicate prayers to his soul, it could not silence the voices that claimed even centuries later that his death was simply the justice of a God who does not suffer tyrants for long. Others, however, feared a different outcome, not that the king had failed God, but that his killers had that in striking the crown they had struck at divinity itself, and that the skies would not remain quiet forever. Storms would come. Empires would fall. Blood would be answered with blood. And so when Louis XVI went to the guillotine in 1793, his final words were not just a cry of innocence, but a spiritual warning. I die innocent. I pray that my blood may not fall on France. And though the blade silenced him, the echoes of that prayer would linger as France staggered into chaos, civil war, and terror, giving birth to the idea that perhaps he had not died alone, that God himself had watched and would not forget. And what of those kings whose deaths were murky, whose ends came in shadows and silence, where no one could say for certain whether justice had been served or blasphemy committed? Henry VI, murdered quietly in the Tower, was long believed to be a holy king, a gentle soul more monk than monarch. And when miracles were later reported at his grave, healings, visions, strange lights, his name was lifted not by statesmen, but by pilgrims. His crown replaced by an imagined halo, as though heaven had reclaimed him after earth had failed him. And then there are those like Alexander the Great, whose death defied explanation entirely, and who in death was treated not only as a hero, but as a demigod, embalmed and paraded like a sacred object, worshipped by some as a son of Zeus, his body uncorrupted for days or so. They claimed a sign, perhaps, that the divine was not offended, but satisfied, or that Alexander had never truly belonged to mortal kingdoms at all. Because religion, like politics, is always looking for meaning, for patterns, for punishment, for prophecy, and the violent death of a king is too loud, too symbolic, too intimate with fate to be ignored by those who speak for God. And so pulpits thundered and shrines were built. Kings were called saints or sinners, their killers labeled heroes or heretics. And beneath it all was the terrible uncertainty, the question no one dared to answer. But everyone feared not just why did he die, but what does it mean when God lets his anointed fall? There is a moment, brief, tremulous, but unmistakable in the seconds, just after a king dies, when the blade has fallen, or the poison has taken hold, or the silence of suffocation has finished its grim work, when the candles still flicker, and the blood has not yet cooled, and the body still bears the warmth of a man who minutes ago held the weight of a nation in his breath. And in that moment, something ancient ends, not just a life, not just a rule, but a rhythm, a continuity, a thread that held time together in a way the people did not even notice until it had snapped. Because a king, for all his robes and words and worries, is more than just a person. He is a point of gravity, a calendar, a compass, a figure through which 1,000 stories are told, and upon whom 1,000 more depend. And when he falls, the architecture of meaning trembles, not because it cannot survive without him, but because it has forgotten how to. And so the death of a monarch is never just the death of a man, but the sudden collapse of a pattern, the disorientation of a people who wake to find the sun rising, but not knowing where to face. The courtiers will whisper, of course, and the priests will prepare their phrases, and the scribes will sharpen their quills, but even they, the ones who serve closest, who feed upon proximity to power, pause for. There is no script for the moment. Between the breath and the bell, no official ceremony for the hush that comes before the succession, only instinct, only silence, only the hollow space where certainty used to sit. And in that space comes fear. Not always loud, not always visible, but deep, for if a king can be brought down, what else can fall if the one anointed and guarded and praised and obeyed can bleed like any other man, can tremble like any other man, can cry out and die without answer, then what safety remains for anyone else? That is what truly ends when the king dies, not just a dynasty, not just a policy or a title, but the illusion that some things do not end. Because kings, more than any other figure in human memory, have been used to symbolize continuity, to bind generations together, to mark the years, to give the impression that the world, though chaotic, has a center. And when that center is torn out, not by time but by violence, not by age but by steel or fire or betrayal, then it is not only the royal line that feels the rupture. It is the culture, the myth, the very sense of how time flows and where authority comes from. And yet life does go on. The bells ring, the mourning clothes are cut, a new king is named. The court returns to its banquets and speeches and ceremonies, and history resumes. But it resumes slightly off-kilter, with a scar beneath the crown, a knowledge that was once only whispered and now lives in every corridor, that power is not eternal, that thrones are not nailed to the earth, and that even the highest can fall. And in that knowledge, bitter, sobering, inescapable, there is a kind of freedom too. For once the lie is broken, once the divine mask slips, once the crown is seen not as a sacred halo, but as a symbol made by hands and broken by hands, then those who follow, whether kings or commoners, must ask what it is they rule or follow or believe in, and whether the old rituals still hold, or if they were only ever beautiful distractions from the truth that lay behind the velvet, that all rule is temporary, that no one is untouchable, and that the curtain falls for everyone eventually, even if they wear gold. So when the king dies, truly dies, it is not only the end of a reign. It is the end of pretending that reigns do not end, and that more than any crown or title or bloodline is the true inheritance of royal death, not just a kingdom passed from hand to hand, but the reminder that all hands fail and all kings fall, and that even history, for all its glory and polish, is just the stage where each monarch plays his part before the curtain falls one final time. It is not only the blood that fascinates, nor the politics, nor even the drama of betrayal and execution. What lingers long after the blade has rusted and the tombs have been sealed is the whisper, that faint murmur behind the stories, the one that asks, not just how these kings died, but why we still care. why we tell their tales again and again in books and ballads and bedtime stories, why we lean in when we hear of crowns slipping and swords rising of monarchs, waking to find their guards have vanished of palaces that echo a little too loudly when power is about to change hands. Perhaps it is because deep down we are drawn to those who seem untouchable, and more deeply still we are drawn to the moment when they are touched, when the untouchable becomes mortal, when the golden thread frays, when the man beneath the crown is finally revealed to be just that, a man breakable, flawed, and finite. There is a reason we remember how they died more vividly than how they lived. It is not just morbid curiosity. It is because death reveals the truth, not only about them, the kings, but about the world that made them. The world that obeyed them, feared them, loved or hated them. And perhaps it tells us something about ourselves, about what we revere, about what we resent, about how close we all live to the edge of power, even if only in our dreams. So we remember the poison. We remember the scaffold. We remember the locked door and the midnight knock. Not because we envy kings, but because we too live with whispers behind our thrones. Now let the stories grow still. Let the cries and swords and shouts soften into echoes, and let those echoes drift far into the distance where time forgets its urgency and memory loses its sharp corners. The torches are dimming now in the long halls of power, and the great banners that once flapped in war-stained wind have begun to fall, gently folding into the hush of history, where even the proudest crowns gather dust like any other object left too long untouched. You have walked beside kings tonight, not in their glory, but in their final moments, and you have felt the pulse of their fear, the silence of their full, and the strange, heavy weight of a throne when no one is left to sit upon it. But that time is passing now, and the golden symbols are slipping back into the pages that hold them best, not pages of law or decree, but pages of story, where they cannot hurt or command, only remind and warn and wonder. Let your breath grow slower. Let your thoughts wander not to the blades, but to the spaces left behind them, the quiet corridors, the still tapestries, the glint of candlelight on stone floors that will outlast the kings who once strode across them. Let the last crown fall quietly, not with grief, not with fear, but with understanding that even the greatest must rest, and even the loudest stories must end in a whisper. And in that whisper feel the hush of safety, of endings accepted, of burdens set down. Sleep now not as a king, but as someone who has watched them all pass into history, and who with eyes closed listens only to the silence that follows.